April 1865. A man walks alone into a theater in Washington. He's wearing a top hat. He's just won the bloodiest war his country has ever known, and in a few hours, he'll be dead. That night at Ford's Theater, not only did Abraham Lincoln's life end, but also the last illusion that that war had truly resolved something. Because the Civil War, the conflict that for four years divided the United States into two nations that hated each other with a ferocity the world had never expected from such a young republic, wasn't just a war. It was the moment when America discovered that beneath its founding ideals lay a contradiction so profound and so violent that it could only be resolved with fire. It could give it to me. 620,000 dead soldiers, more casualties than in all other American wars combined up until the 20th century. Cities razed, families torn apart, brothers pointing rifles at each other on battlefields with names that today sound like nightmares. Antietam, Gettysburg, Cole Harbor. And behind it all, a question that no one wanted to answer clearly. Did a human being have the right to own another human being? What you're about to hear now is the full story of how a nation destroyed itself and how, in rebuilding itself, it was scarred forever. To understand why it all blew up, you have to go back a long way before the first shot was fired. You have to go back to the years when the United States was still a fragile promise, a federation of states that shared a flag, but not much else. From the very founding of the Republic in 1776, there had been a silent fracture between the North and the South. The North was industrializing at full speed. Factories, railroads, cities that grew with immigrants from Europe. The South was something else. The South was cotton, it was tobacco, it was rice, and it was slavery. 4 million people in chains, working the land, rodopiring to enrich a small elite of white landowners who had built their entire identity, their entire economy, and their entire worldview on that institution. They called it an institution, as if it were a library or a bank, as if it were a normal thing to do. And for decades, politicians in Washington had managed to maintain the balance by compromising. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, agreements that attempted to divide the new territories in the West between the free and the slave states so that neither bloc would gain too much power in Congress. But each compromise was more fragile than the last. Each agreement left more people dissatisfied on both sides, and tension continued to build like steam in a sealed boiler. In the South, large landowners were not the majority mechan. In fact, most white Southerners did not own slaves. But the system worked in such a way that even the poorest among them had learned to see slavery as the foundation of their social order, the buttress of a hierarchy that ensured they were above everyone else. Southern politicians knew this and exploited it masterfully. When the North began to talk about limiting the expansion of slavery into the new territories in the West, the South interpreted it as an existential threat, not just an economic one, an existential one, an identity-based one, a threat to what they called their way of life. The breaking point came in the form of a man who didn't even appear on the ballot in the South.
This is what happens when my duck and I get bored. So we reached out for some ideas, and someone said, you gotta try the skate park.
And who didn't even appear on the ballot in the South? Abraham Lincoln, a Republican from Illinois, a lawyer born in a log cabin in Kentucky, too. A family so poor that as a child he had little access to formal education. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the radical sense of the word, at least not publicly, at least not yet. His official position was that he had no intention of touching slavery where it already existed, but that he could not allow its expansion. For the South, that was enough. When Lincoln won the presidential election in November 1860, the reaction was immediate. On December 16, 1860, just weeks after the election results, South Carolina seceded from the Union. The Declaration of Secession was explicit. It did not speak of states' rights in the abstract. He talked about slavery. He said that the northern states had elected a man whose views and purposes were hostile to slavery. That was reason enough to leave. In the following months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. Those 7 states formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi and former Secretary of War, as president. Jefferson Davis was the very picture of the Southern elite, a large plantation owner in Mississippi, a man educated at West Point, the United States Military Academy, and a veteran of the Mexican War. At the time of secession, he was 52 years old and convinced that the South had the legal and moral right to leave. He believed that the conflict would be brief, that the North did not have the stomach for war, that Europe, which depended on Southern cotton for its textile industries, would intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. He was wrong about all of them. Lincoln arrived in Washington for his inauguration in March 1861, on a train with the blinds drawn. He had received death threats. The city was filled with Southern sympathizers. In his inaugural address, he made one last attempt to reach out to the South. He said he had neither the intention nor the right to interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it already existed. He said they were not enemies, but friends. The South did not listen. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal installation on Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and the garrison commander, Major Robert Anderson, held out for 34 hours, then surrendered, and for a leave. No one was killed in the bombardment, which was almost ironic, given what was to come. But the shot was fired. The war had begun. The response in the North was one of euphoria that, in retrospect, is almost incomprehensible. Thousands of volunteers showed up at recruiting stations convinced that it would be over in 90 days. 75,000 men answered Lincoln's initial call. In the South, it was the same. Young men who had never before held a rifle formed long lines to enlist. Both sides believed that a decisive battle would settle the matter. No one anticipated 4 years of hell. In Virginia, the most powerful state in the South, the debate over secession was agonizing. Virginia had not initially voted to secede, but when Lincoln asked for soldiers to subdue the rebel states, the tide turned. Virginia was not about to use its sons to fight other Southerners. On April 16, 1861, Virginia joined the Confederacy, and with Virginia came the man who would become the military symbol of the Confederate War. Robert Edward Lee was 54 when Virginia seceded. He was one of the most respected officers in the United States Army. He had fought with distinction in Mexico. He was the son-in-law of George Washington's adopted son. Winfield Scott, the general-in-chief of the Army, considered him the best officer he had and offered him command of the Union Army. Lee spent a sleepless night pondering the offer. He then declined the command. He said that although he personally opposed secession and considered slavery a wrong, he could not raise a sword against his home family and native land. He went to Richmond, the new Confederate capital, and took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Union soldiers would spend the next 3 years trying and failing to defeat him. The first major land battle was a disaster for the North. On July 25, 1861, at a creek called Bull Run in northern Virginia, the armies met for the first time on a large scale. The inhabitants of Washington, convinced that they would witness a quick and easy victory, approached in carriages to watch the spectacle from the nearby hills. They brought food and telescopes. What they saw left them speechless. The poorly trained and poorly coordinated Union troops were repulsed by the Confederates in a series of chaotic battles that ended in complete Reinhard. The soldiers fled mixed with the civilians who had come to look around. Carriages overturned in the roads. Men dropped their rifles to make faster runs. Washington panicked. Many thought the Confederates would advance on the capital that night. They did not. The Confederates were also too disorganized to pursue, but the Battle of Bull Run had enormous consequences. I'm sure if it is. In the North, it shattered the illusion of the 90 days in one fell swoop. Lincoln signed decree after decree calling for 400,000 volunteers. Congress approved unprecedented war funds, and Lincoln searched for a general who could organize his dismembered army. He found one in George Brinton McClellan, a Napoleonic-looking 34-year-old who sometimes called himself the young Napoleon, and who had an extraordinary ability to train and organize troops and an equally extraordinary aversion to using them in combat. McClellan built the Army of the Potomac, the Union's principal army, with admirable efficiency and mustaimian. He gave him uniforms, discipline, artillery, logistics. The soldiers adored him. And then McLean refused to attack week after week, month after month. There was always a reason to wait. The enemy was too numerous, he said, although spies gave him exaggerated figures that he never questioned. The terrain was unfavorable. The troops needed more training. Lincoln pressed him in person and in writing with a patience that wore thin with each unanswered letter. On one occasion, in exasperation, he wrote to the general, "If you don't plan on using the army, could you lend me one?" While McLean hesitated in the East, things were different in the West. A general named Ulysses Simpson Grant, who had left the army. Grant took Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson in Tennessee, capturing more than 12,000 Confederate soldiers in one fell swoop. When the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant responded with a phrase that made headlines in northern newspapers. No terms were acceptable except immediate and unconditional surrender. Newspapers started to claim that the initials U.S. in the name of Grant actually stood for the term unconditional surrender, unkame plainkamtina. But April 1862 brought the first major demonstration of what this war was really about. On April 6 and 7, at a Tennessee town called Shiloh, near a small Methodist church whose name in Hebrew, Z means place of peace, and Is, a battery took place. The Confederates attacked by surprise on the first day and came close to destroying Grant's army. But Union soldiers, many of them recruits who had never seen combat, were driven back to the Tennessee River. That night, in the rain, Grant sat under a tree and smoked his cigar. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had had his horse shot under him twice that day, came up and said, "We had some bad luck today." Grant replied calmly, "Yes. Let's make that up tomorrow." And the next day, with reinforcements arriving by river, the Union Army counterattacked and forced the Confederates to retreat. The casualties were appalling. 13,000 killed and wounded on the Union side, 10,000 on the Confederate side. In 2 days, on a field in Tennessee, more men had fallen than in all the wars in American history up to that point. The photographs and telegrams that reached the northern newspapers produced a massive shock. Suddenly, the war was something different than anyone had imagined. In the South, the news was no better. The Confederate commander at Show, Albert Sidney Johnston, considered by many to be the South's greatest general, died in battle from bleeding from a leg wound that would have been trivial with a tourniquet wound. Johnston had no tourniquet. No one noticed until it was too late. The Confederacy would never replace that loss. Meanwhile, in the East, the war continued in Lee's hands and McClellan's endless indecision. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally launched his major campaign. Rather than advancing directly on Richmond by land, he transported more than 100,000 men by sea to the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, southeast of the Confederate capital. The strategy was to encircle Lee. For weeks, McClellan advanced slowly toward Richmond, stopping at every obstacle, calling for reinforcements that were never enough. When he was within 9 miles of the city, he stopped. He could hear the church bells of Richmond, and he waited. Lee did not wait. With his new command, he reorganized the Confederate Army with a speed that surprised everyone and launched a series of furious attacks known as the 7 Days. From June 25 to July 1st, 1862. In tactical terms, the 7 Days battles did not result in any clear-cut victories for either of the two opposing sides. Lee attacked with an aggression that sometimes bordered on recklessness and paid a huge price in casualties. McClellan retreated in an orderly fashion, but the strategic result was devastating for the Union. The Peninsular Campaign was over. Richmond would not be taken in 1862. McClellan would never come this close again. The figure who emerged in these battles alongside Lee was Thomas Jonathan Jackson, a former professor of artillery at the Virginia Military Academy, a man of strange manias, intense religiosity, and long silences, who had earned his permanent nickname at the First Battle of Bull Run. As the Confederate lines began to give way, a Southern general pointed toward Jackson and his men, who were standing firm, and shouted, "There stands Jackson, standing like a stone wall and say, "Oh no." From that moment on, he was Stonewall Jackson, the Stonewall. His troops called him Old Tom or Uncle Jack, and were absolutely devoted to him because Jackson won battles. In the Shenandoah Valley, with barely 16,000 men, Jackson had maneuvered with such speed and skill that he kept more than 60,000 Union troops busy for months, preventing them from reinforcing the Peninsular Campaign. Sometimes he covered 30 miles in a day. His troops were known as Jackson's Foot Mules. The summer of 1862 brought more Confederate victories in the East. The Second Battle of Bull Run in August was another humiliation for the Union. General John Pope, who had arrived in Virginia boasting of his victories in the West End, publicly disparaging McClellan's cautious style, was systematically destroyed by Lee and Jackson in a brilliant two-pronged Operation Is Rigid. Lee pinned down Pope's army with part of his own forces, while Jackson made a 50-mile march in 2 days to fall on enemy supply lines. When Pope turned to confront Jackson, Lee attacked with the rest of his army. Pope was swept from the field. His troops fled back to Washington for the second time in little more than a year. Lee now decided to take the war north. In September 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. It was a huge gamble. He hoped that a victory on northern soil would convince the border states to join the Confederacy, demoralize the North enough to force peace negotiations, and, most importantly, attract diplomatic recognition from Great Britain and France, who were following the conflict with great interest given their dependence on southern cotton Ethiopia. What occurred instead was the bloodiest battle of the entire war. On September 17, 1862, within a cornfield and beside a creek that was called at Antioch in Maryland, Lee and McClellan's armies clashed in a battle of violence neither side would ever forget. McClellan had 87,000 men. Lee had 45,000, and yet McClellan attacked in piecemeal fashion, failing to coordinate his assaults, allowing Lee to shift his reserves from one critical point to the next. The fighting lasted 12 hours without a break. In a cornfield, it took a Union brigade 30 minutes to lose more than 2,200 men. On a sunken road that local farmers used as a shortcut between their farms, the Confederate defenders piled up so many bodies that the road was literally littered with corpses. That road has since become known as the Bloody Road. By sundown, 22,000 men had been killed or wounded in a single day. It is the single deadliest day throughout the history of the U.S. military. Either way, photographer Alexander Garner arrived 2 days later and documented the cornfields covered in corn, ornament, corpses, in images that were exhibited in New York and left visitors stunned in silence. One viewer wrote, quote, "The war showed us only its glorious side, Guantirica. Mr. Brady has brought up glorious side, Guantirica. Mr. Brady has brought us its ugly side." Tactically, Antietam was a brutal draw. Strategically, it was enough for Lincoln to claim it as a Union victory because Lee retreated from Maryland. And that was all Lincoln needed. He had been preparing for months something that his cabinet and generals had advised him not to not to he had a credible victory. 5 days after Antietam on September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, all slaves in the rebelling states would be freed. The document was politically complex. It did not free slaves in the border states that remained in the Union because Lincoln could afford to lose them. It only freed slaves in territories that the Union did not control, which meant that in immediate practical terms, its effect was limited. Critics immediately pointed this out. A Chicago newspaper described it as a farce that freed no one, where the government had power and promised to free those it could not reach. But symbolically, it was an earthquake. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about abolition. That definitively closed the door to European recognition of the Confederacy. Neither Great Britain nor France, with their anti-slavery traditions, could now support the South without unbearable political cost at home. It also took the opportunity to grant black men the right to enlist in the military. Over the course of the war, 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army. Their initial terms were disgraceful. They were paid less than white soldiers. His officers, at first, had to be white. If captured, they were treated not as prisoners of war, but as fugitive slaves, which meant sail or death, bow death. But they fought in the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, composed mostly of black soldiers, charged to Confederate positions in open ground and suffered nearly half its strength in killed and wounded Nunavut Runtonen. Their commander, Colonel Robert Gish, the son of a Boston abolitionist family, died leading the charge. The Confederates buried him in a mass grave with his soldiers as an insult. Shaw's family responded that they could imagine no greater honor for their son. The winter and spring of 1863 were ones of continued disaster for the Union in the East. Lincoln had finally replaced McClellan after Antietam, when the general continued to refuse to pursue Lee's army. His replacement was Ambrose Burnside, an honest man who knew he was not right for the job, and said so openly. Burnside confirmed his own doubts in December 1862 at Fredericksburg, Virginia, when he sent waves of infantry across open ground under concentrated fire from the Confederates, who were entrenched on hills from which they had perfect field of fire. 14 rounds in one day, 12,500 Union casualties. We watched the spectacle from his positions and said a phrase that sums up something of the horror of those years. It is well that war is so terrible, or we should love it too much. Burnside was replaced by Joseph Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe Riat. Arrelie cara sarchiro karais drturodum. Uti sar karlias gurent idirimi suardutar kodrberenias komöres aktitargar drubiban. In the spring of 1863, with an army of 130,000 men against Lee's 60,000, Hooker planned a brilliant encirclement maneuver on paper. But when Lee responded with exactly the same move, dividing his forces in the face of a superior enemy, sending Jackson on a flank march that fell upon the unprotected flank of Hooker's army, At a hex called Chancellorsville, Hooker was brought to a standstill. It was Lee's greatest victory of the entire war. It was also his most costly. On the evening of May 2nd, 1863, as Jackson returned from reconnoitering the terrain in front of his lines, his own soldiers mistook him in the darkness for enemy cavalry and hit him with a volley of cannon fire. Jackson lost his left arm. Lee, when he received the news, said, quote, "Whoa, he has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." 8 days later, Jackson died of pneumonia. He was 39 years old. The South never recovered from that loss, but it was the summer of 1863 that decided the fate of the war. Although no one knew it at the time, and it decided it in two places at the same time, more than 10 miles apart, between July 4th and July 4. Lee had decided to invade the North again. He needed to get his army out of the devastated soil of Virginia, where food was scarce. He needed a victory on Northern soil to renew pressure, peace in Washington, and he needed to divert attention from what was happening on the Mississippi, where Grant had been tightening the noose around Pittsburgh for weeks. Lee's army entered Pennsylvania in June 1863. Three northern cities, which had previously seen the war only in telegrams and newspapers, were able to see it in their streets. Confederate soldiers, many barefoot after months of campaigning, entered Pittsburgh on the last day of June, searching for a shipment of shoes that intelligence indicated was stored there. Once. Instead, they found Union cavalry the next day, July 1st, 1863. The accidental clash turned into a battle. In 3 days, in the fields and hills surrounding the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the largest battle in American history was fought. On the first day, Lee attacked successfully, pushing the Union forces through the town and into the hills to the south. But those hills, Cemetery Richard and the surrounding heights, were a formidable defensive position. General George Meade, who had assumed command of the Union Army only 4 days earlier, organized his defense with efficiency. The second day was a bloodbath. The Confederate right wing under General James Longstreet attacked with brutal ferocity toward a cluster of granite rocks known as Devil's Den and toward a wooded hill called Little Round Top. If Little Round Top fell, the entire Union line could be rolled back. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, a rhetoric teacher from Maine who had enlisted as a volunteer, held the summit of Little Round Top with Maine's 20th Regiment until his men were nearly out of ammunition. Then he ordered the bayonets and charged down the slope. The exhausted Confederates, convinced that such a counterattack could only mean that the Yankees had fresh reserves, broke. The third day was the final chapter. Lee, convinced that the center of the Union line was vulnerable after the fighting of the previous days, ordered a massive assault on Cemetery Ridge. More than 12,500 Confederate soldiers under the command of General George Pickett formed their lines in the woods west of the ridge. What followed was known as Pickett's Charge, although troops from several commands participated in it. The men marched in perfect formation across nearly a mile and a half open ground to the top of a ridge, defended by artillery and darts and infantry. Union guns swept them apart in groups. The lines broke. Those who reached the ridge, a few hundred, were surrounded and captured or destroyed. In less than an hour, Pickett had lost more than half his division. When Lee asked him to reorganize his division for a possible counterattack, Pickett replied, "General, I have no division left." Lee took full responsibility for his men returning. Lost it. Historians have debated for decades whether that was true. Longstreet, who had opposed the frontal assault on the third day and had advocated a flanking maneuver, died a favorite scapegoat for the Confederates who preferred not to blame Lee mi antla. But the fact is that Vicksburg cost Lee's army over 28,000 casualties in 3 days. It would never again have the offensive capability to invade the North. 9 miles to the south, the same week as Gettysburg, Grant completed his masterpiece. Gettysburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled Gettysburg controlled the river, and whoever controlled the river cut the Confederacy in two. Grant had spent months maneuvering to attack the city in a campaign of movements that military textbooks would study decades later. When the frontal assault failed, Grant laid siege to the city. Vicksburg's residents and the soldiers defending it spent weeks under almost continuous bombardment, living in caves dug into the hillsides, eating mules, rats, anything. It's just shit. On July 4th, 1863, the garrison commander, General John Pemberton, surrendered with 30,000 men. The Mississippi River was open from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. The Confederacy was torn in half. Lincoln, upon receiving news of the dual victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, wrote Grant a letter admitting that he had second-guessed his tactical decisions during the campaign and that he had been wrong. Few presidents in American history have written anything like this to one of his generals. Hey, Lee, see. But the war continued. The South did not surrender. Jefferson Davis and most Confederate leaders believed they could hold out long enough to wear down Northern will, and they had reason to think so. The November 1864 presidential election was approaching. The Democrats had nominated McLaughlin himself, who ran on a platform of negotiated peace. Peace. In the North, weariness was real. The draft system was deeply unfair. A man could pay $300 to get out of the draft, which meant that the poor fought while the rich paid. In July 1863, anti-draft protests in New York City escalated into 4 days of riots, during which mobs of Irish laborers fearing competition from freed slave labor rampaged through the city, storming draft offices, lynching several African Americans, and killing more than 100 people. Lincoln had to send veteran troops from Gettysburg straight from the battlefield into the streets of the nation's largest city. In the summer of 1864, Lincoln wrote in a note he kept in a sealed envelope that he was unlikely to win re-election. General Ulysses Grant's Virginia campaign had begun in May with the crossing of the Rapidan River and the Battle of the Wilderness. 3 days of fighting in a thicket so dense that trees burned and wounded men who could not move burned to death in the forest. Mastwan. Union casualties at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and on the road to Petersburg in a month and a half of campaigning exceeded 50,000 men. The newspapers called Grant the Butcher. Lincoln defended him. I can't do without this man fighting, because Grant did something no Union commander in the East had ever done before One. After each battle, instead of retreating to regroup, he always pushed south, always pressing on. Grant understood something fundamental about the nature of war that his predecessors had failed to understand. The goal was not to capture Richmond. The goal was to destroy Lee's army, and to do that, it was necessary to give him no respite. In June 1864, Grant laid siege to Petersburg, a city south of Richmond, whose fall would mean the collapse of the Confederate capital. Lee dug in. The siege would last 9 months. Soldiers on both sides dug miles of trenches, built bunkers, installed wire, and learned that sticking their heads out at the wrong time was the last decision they would make in life. In many ways, the siege of Petersburg was a foretaste of what World War I would become 50 years later. One particular episode from the siege of Petersburg deserves to be recounted. A regiment of miners from Pennsylvania had the idea of digging a tunnel under the Confederate lines, filling it with gunpowder, and blowing it up to create a breach in the enemy defenses. The tunnel, more than 164 feet long, took a month to build. In the early morning hours of July 30, 1864, the explosion was enormous. It created a crater 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 25 feet deep. Union soldiers charged into the crater and then found themselves trapped inside it, trapped by its sheer walls and unable to escape. The Confederates, recovering from their initial shock, circled the rim of the crater and fired down on the huddled men. The Battle of the Crater was another Union disaster with 4,000 casualties. Grant described it as the most deplorable thing I have ever seen in the war. Posse sent Mari in Virginia, General William Sherman was executing the Union's other great strategy in Georgia. Sherman did not believe in decisive battles. He believed in something different and more terrifying, destroying the enemy's will to conduct the war. In May 1864, he set out from Chattanooga with 100,000 men headed for Atlanta, the great railroad hub of the South. In a 100-day campaign, constantly maneuvering to outflank his Confederate opponent, General Joseph Johnston, he advanced toward Atlanta without fighting any major frontal battles, but he never stopped. President Davis, exasperated by Johnston's slowness and constant strategic retreats, replaced him with General John Bell Hood, a reckless fighter who had lost an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, and who had tied to his horse to ride, and Hood launched frontal assaults on Sherman, costing the Confederate Army thousands of ill-affordable casualties. Atlanta fell on September 2nd, 1864. News reached the North 3 weeks before the election. Lincoln won by a landslide. Confederate hopes of forcing a negotiated peace through the Northern ballot box evaporated. Sherman evacuated all civilians from Atlanta and then burned it to the ground. In November 1864, the march to the sea began. A column of 60,000 troops that advanced more than 280 miles from Atlanta to Savannah on the Atlantic Ocean. living on the land, destroying everything of military value. Railroads, granaries, mills, bridges. For Sherman did not want his soldiers to attack civilians, and by and large they did. Although looting and excesses were inevitable, what Sherman wanted was for the South to understand that there was no sanctuary, that the war came to the homestead, the plantations, to the farms. That continued resistance came at a cost that the families of Confederate soldiers would pay in their own homes. And that Sherman called this making Georgia howl anew. Georgia howled. The South was sinking, but it would not surrender. The winter of 1864 to 65 was the hardest of the war for Lee's soldiers in the trenches. Trenches at Petersburg, not a say. Poorly fed, poorly equipped, and desertion accelerating with each passing month. Men who had fought for 3 years remained in their positions. Some out of loyalty, some out of conviction, many because they had nowhere else to go, or because they didn't know it was a different war, faced a different war. Within the prison camps of the North, captured Confederate soldiers perished from hunger and the cold. In the camps of the South, Union prisoners perished under conditions that were even worse. The Andersonville camp in Georgia held more than 32,000 Union prisoners on its 80 acres under a cruelty that went beyond what any of its defenders could justify. Nearly 13,000 died there. In its final weeks of existence, the Confederacy even discussed the unthinkable, arming slaves to fight in exchange for their freedom. The proposal divided the South with a brutality that laid bare the central contradiction of the entire Confederate enterprise. If slavery was the moral and economic foundation of the Confederacy, how could the South promise freedom to its slaves in exchange for its defense? It was an admission that the system they had fought 4 years to preserve was incompatible with the very survival of the state that defended it. The Confederate Congress passed the measure in March 1865. It came too late to make any difference. Sin. On April 2, 1865, Grant broke through the lines at Petersburg. Lee evacuated the city that same night and telegraphed to Davis that Richmond, too, must be evacuated. Davis received the message during a church service. He left without a word to the congregation around him. Confederate troops set fire to the city's warehouses to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread. When Union troops entered Richmond the next day, they found the city in flames with its own inhabitants struggling to put it out. Abraham Lincoln visited Richmond 2 days after its fall, walking the streets with only a small escort. The freed slaves of the town surrounded him. Some knelt before him. Lincoln urged them not to. "Wait," he said, "do not kneel before me. Thank God and pray for what comes next." What came next was swift. Lee marched west with the remnants of his army, seeking to join General Johnston's forces in the Carolinas. Grant pursued him relentlessly, cutting him off at every possible point. On April 9, 1865, in a town called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, with his army surrounded and no chance of escape, Lee asked to meet with Grant to discuss terms of surrender with Gordon. They met in the living room of a man named McKilleen, who had the distinction of having lived on the battlefield of Bull Run, the first major Battle of the War and having moved to Appomattox precisely to escape the conflict. The war began in his backyard and ended in his living room. Lee arrived in full dress uniform, ceremonial sword, and shiny boots. Grant arrived in the field uniform he was wearing, wrinkled and muddy with no sword. The terms Grant offered were generous, beyond what many in the North had expected. Confederate soldiers could keep their horses, which they would need for the year's harvest. Officers could keep their pistols. No one would be tried for treason as long as they abided by the terms of surrender. Clay read the terms with visible emotion and said that they would be received with great pleasure by his army. When Grant ordered the Union batteries to fire celebratory salutes, he stopped them. He said that the rebels were now his countrymen and that he did not want to humiliate them. The Union soldiers who were stationed in front of the Confederate lines began to cheer and celebrate. Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top who had survived the war with severe wounds, was designated to receive the formal surrender of Lee's army. As Confederate troops filed out to lay down their arms and flags, Chamberlain ordered his soldiers to present arms, the highest military salute. Confederate General John Gordon, leading the column, returned the salute in kind. Chamberlain would later write that there was no jeer, no words of triumph, no sounds of jubilation, only the sound of rifles being dropped to the ground by the vanquished. Lincoln did not live to see the reconciliation he had envisioned. 5 days after Appomattox, on April 14, 1865, while attending a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., he was shot in the head. The author was John Wilkes Booth, a Southern stage actor who believed that with Lincoln's death he could reverse the outcome of the war. And Lincoln died the next morning without regaining consciousness. He was 56. Booth's plan was more ambitious. That same night, his accomplices were to attack Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Stewart. The attack on Stewart took place, leaving him badly wounded but alive. The attack on Johnson was never carried out. Booth fled to the south and was married off by the army 12 days later in a barn in Virginia, where he died in a fire his captors set to free him. His accomplices were court-martialed, and 4 of them were hanged. Lincoln's death changed what might have been the Reconstruction of the South. Lincoln had advocated a policy of generous reintegration. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, contained a phrase that summed up his vision. With rancor toward none, with charity for all, with steadfastness in right as God gives us to see right. Vice President Johnson, who assumed the presidency, was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who did not share Lincoln's commitment to the rights of freedmen and whose Reconstruction policy was so lax that Southern states immediately began passing so-called black laws, legislation that restricted the freedom of movement, labor, and civil rights of former slaves in a way that effectively replicated many of the conditions of slavery. Congress, controlled by radical Republicans, went to war with Johnson, nearly removing him from office by a single vote in the impeachment process. The results of the war in numbers are hard to absorb. 620,000 soldiers killed, although more recent estimates put the figure at 750,000. More than 400,000 wounded. Hundreds of thousands of civilians dead from disease, starvation, and violence. The South in ruins, with an economy that took decades to recover. 4 million people formerly freed from slavery but left, mostly landless, without resources, without real legal protection, at the mercy of the very men who had enslaved them and who now, with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, re-established their political control with systematic violence that lasted almost 100 more years. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery, Taoist slavery. The Charter Amendment of 1888 guaranteed citizenship to all born or naturalized in the United States. The Fifth Amendment of 1870 guaranteed the right to vote without regard to race, but the amendments, on paper and the lived reality in the southern states, remain two very different things for different things for generations. Monuments to Confederate leaders began to be erected not in the immediate post-war years, but decades later, many of them during the Jim Crow period, and then during the years of the Civil Rights Movement, as statements of resistance to change rather than acts of historical memory. The Confederacy lost the war, but it long won the battle for narrative constructing the myth of the lost cause that presented the war as a noble struggle for states' rights and the Southern way of life, stripping slavery of its centrality in the conflicts of conflict. The state's own declarations of secession, which explicitly cited slavery as the reason for their separation, were buried under decades of this alternative narrative. Lee died in 1870. 5 years after the war, having become president of a Virginia university, Grant served 2 terms as president. He struggled with alcohol all his life, lost his fortune in a swindle, and dictated his memoirs as he lay dying of throat cancer in a race against time to leave money for his family. He finished them 4 days before he died. They are widely considered the finest military memoirs written by an American statesman. Sherman outlived them all, dying in 1891. Hated throughout his life in the South for his march through Georgia, and beloved by his northern soldiers, Stonewall Jackson was buried in Lexington, Virginia. His amputated left arm was buried in a different place, upon the battlefield at Chancellorsville. For decades, the arm had its own grave with its own headstone. Joshua Chamberlain, the professor of rhetoric who had defended Little Round Top with a bayonet charge. He was governor of Maine, president of Bowie College, and lived until 1914. Almost until the beginning of World War I, he died. Wounds received in the storming of Fort Stedman in 1864. Alama. Wounds that never fully healed. He was the last veteran of the war to die of combat wounds. The privates, those who had left their farms and their workshops and their stores to die at Bull Run and Antietam and Gettysburg and the Wilderness, and then Vicksburg and Atlanta and Appomattox, came home with what they had. Many never came back. Of those who did, some never spoke of what they had seen. Others could not stop talking about it. Their children heard the stories, or they did not hear them. Their grandchildren fought World War I without ever fully understanding what had happened a generation before. And the question that had been at the center of it all, the question of whether the promise of equality written in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 applied to all or just some, remained unanswered for decades. It remains unanswered today. What Abraham Lincoln said at Gisborne in November 1863, at the dedication of the cemetery where the dead of that battle were laid to rest, was brief. Just 2 minutes. The keynote speaker at the ceremony, Edward Everett, had spoken for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes, and he changed forever the meaning of that war and that country. He said that those men had given the full measure of their devotion, and that the living could not consecrate that soil because they had already consecrated it with their blood. And he said that the nation would have a new birth of freedom, and that government